Welcome back, everyone, to session 3 of Harnessing the Science of Learning. Let's get started. We will begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that ONlit-org's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. So welcome everybody to ONlit-org's Harnessing the Science of Learning book study. I'm so excited that you'll be joining us tonight as we are already at the halfway point of our time together. Let's bring joy to our students by harnessing the science of learning together. So I'm Laura Bross. I'm a grade 2-3 classroom educator in the Avon-Maitland District School Board, and I'm a member of the curriculum assistance team here at ONlit. A quick look at our schedule. So far, we have heard from Dr. Nathanial Swain via recording, introducing the book and digging into cognitive load theory. Last week, we heard from Dr. Zach Groeschel. Dr. Groeschel explained some key concepts about how learning happens, including cognitive load theory, types of knowledge, novice versus experts, the forgetting curve, and retrieval practice. Tonight, we will be joined by the knowledgeable Dr. Jamey Peavler. Dr. Peavler is an elementary teacher, literacy coach, researcher, instructor, and reading science program director at Mount St. Joseph University. Her research interests include instructional design, the impact of space practice and interleaving, the role of oral language and syntactic awareness on comprehension and written expression, and foundational skills for supporting literacy in the early childhood setting. Dr. Peavler will link cognitive load theory into effective literacy instruction and discuss an MTSS framework to meet the needs of all students across all tiers. So just like last session, we will spend most of our time with our Informed Insights guest. Afterwards, I'll share a few more resources that have been added to our Evidence-Informed Educator series. And then we will wrap up with our next steps. So now that we are all organized, let's pass things over to our Informed Insights expert guest. Welcome, Dr. Jamey Peavler. Just give us a minute so we can pass the screen over and get started.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed listening to your introduction, and I'm thinking that you really do need to change your grade 2-3 to great 2-3, because that's really how I heard it in my head the first time. So you're a great 2-3 teacher. Well, and again, you set up this conversation really nicely. I had the benefit of getting to listen to the last 2 recordings. So, and reading the text as well alongside all of you. And I'm really hoping tonight to be able to connect a lot of what you have heard previously to what that research does in order to empower and inform us on our instructional practices. So I really want to talk more today about the practice end of that information. So just to, again, kind of put us in the right headspace for the conversation tonight, you have already discussed some of the reading science frameworks. And so I'm going to ground a lot of what I want to start out tonight in the simple view of reading. And so within this framework, again, some key principles to remember are that both word recognition and language comprehension are equally important. And I want to set that out in the beginning because it's going to be a little misleading that so many examples I use tonight are going to be focused on word recognition. And so I don't want to imply that language comprehension isn't important, because it is. But when we talk about forms of practice and cognitive load, we're going to really focus on that word recognition end, and I think you'll see why when we break it down. Also, that when we do have students that are experiencing difficulty in one of those areas, we can't compensate for that difficulty by hyper-focusing on building the other. And I know that seems to be almost like a logical step. I often work with older students who are having difficulty with word recognition. And the guidance tends to be, well, if explicit phonics didn't work for them, maybe we don't teach them phonics and we do a different approach and we focus on comprehension. And this framework and the research behind it illustrates that that's just not going to work. We have to build both of those areas. So both our assessment tools and our instructional materials need to really align to what our objectives are. So that's why in a lot of materials, which may be more a traditional basal type resource, using the same story to teach word recognition and language comprehension sometimes isn't effective because very rarely are kids equally yoked in both areas. So we'll get to that a little bit too in just a moment. So kind of setting the stage there. I really first want to talk about word recognition, and we're going to explore a concept that may be familiar to some of you. And it's this idea that when it comes to instruction, we have skills that are considered constrained and then some that are considered unconstrained. So the constrained skills really do align themselves pretty nicely to word recognition, although not exclusively word recognition. There are definitely some constrained skills with language comprehension. But what makes something constrained is that generally there is a finite number of things to learn. So if we think about our alphabet system, 26 letters, that's it. That's all we need to learn to be able to start to crack the code and develop the alphabetic principle. Whereas there are an unlimited number of vocabulary words. So that's why vocabulary is not considered constrained. So constrained could be the number of items. It could also be how easily they can be assessed or developed. So when it comes to measuring whether or not students know their letters, it's not a very complicated assessment to be able to get that information. Whereas determining whether a student has a strong vocabulary base, that's not very easy to do because who gets to decide what vocabulary words are going to make it on a standardized assessment? That's a pretty biased type of decision. And then another important characteristic of constrained skills is that they usually develop in a really linear way. So again, we can't really decode a word that contains letters we've never seen before or that we don't know sound symbol correspondences. So many constrained skills have a progression in which they need to develop. And so if we look at the research behind constrained skills, the quote at the bottom of the screen just reminds us that many constrained skills are more effectively taught when they are targeted, systematic, explicit, short duration, and that we really consider the value of assessing those frequently and ordering them in a way that allows us to spiral on previously learned skills. On the other hand, our unconstrained skills, which align pretty nicely to language comprehension, are unlimited. We are not going to run out of vocabulary words to teach students. And another thing that's really important to know, and this is essential for cognitive load as well, is these skills are codependent. So let's think about language comprehension. If I am listening to a passage or I'm reading a passage on my own, and it contains vocabulary words that I'm unfamiliar with, that might then, because of the codependent relationship, make it impossible for me to understand what the author is saying. Or I might know the vocabulary word, but I don't have the background knowledge to really understand the meaning of the word in the way that the author has used it. So that codependency really is a common characteristic of unconstrained skills. And so because of that too, unconstrained skills often don't have an order in which is essential that it's followed. Whereas in word recognition, there is. We can't really teach multisyllabic words if kids haven't mastered basic vowel sounds. So with language comprehension, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of scope and sequence and those types of things. So that's going to be important as we make our assessment considerations, but also as we make some grouping decisions about putting students together for instruction. So even when we know what to teach and we have this background on what should be done in a systematic and linear way and what might be done with a slightly different approach, it doesn't matter what skill we're talking about. Whether or not the students learn that skill is going to be connected to their working memory capacity. And so you've read and heard a lot about working memory capacity, and you've heard about John Sweller. And so one of the things I think that is important for us as educators to keep in mind as we're delivering lessons. Sometimes when we look at assessment data and we have worked hard and a student has worked hard and we don't see that showing up in the outcome that we're measuring, we feel like the instruction didn't work, or we feel like something went wrong in the system. And that can feel really hurtful as a teacher when you know how hard you've worked and how much you've planned and you just feel like a failure. It's often that we have other components that are involved in that outcome that aren't talked about a lot. And working memory is one, working memory and cognitive load. So even the best designed lesson implemented beautifully may not be effective for some students. And so we need to see what could possibly be adjusted to change that outcome. So that's where we're headed next. So within working memory capacity, I'm going to try to break this down and make this concrete in a way that makes sense to me, because I remember as I was reading a lot of the research for my own dissertation on this, I was getting confused about terminology and what constituted what type of cognitive load. So at the risk of oversimplifying, I'm going to try to illustrate some of these considerations as we might encounter them in a classroom. So the first thing is this red outline that you're seeing is intended to represent your working memory capacity. And as you've read, you are understanding that there's no limit to your long-term memory. We can store lots of things in our long-term memory. And anytime we are retrieving information that is stored, it really enables us to manage things in our working memory better. But all of us have about the same working memory capacity. And there's really nothing that you can do to train up somebody's working memory. But what we can do is consider in our lesson design how to manage it a little bit better. So there are 3 types of load. And so the first load that I want to talk about, again, from a classroom perspective, is intrinsic load. And that's the load that is really connected to what is it that we are expecting students to do and what do they have to manage. And so when I think about that as I'm planning lessons, I think about it in terms of what are the prerequisite skills that they need to have in place. And I'm going to switch gears and talk about long division for just a moment. So if I'm teaching a 4th grader long division, there are a lot of prerequisite skills that have to be in place for that to happen. They need basic multiplication facts down, basic division facts. They need addition and subtraction with regrouping. They need to understand place value so that when they are bringing a 2 down, they know that they're not really bringing the number 2 down, they're bringing the number 200 down. So there are a lot of prerequisite skills that need to be in place. But if a child doesn't have those or doesn't even have one of those, it's going to tax their working memory, because while I'm giving directions and I'm modeling through a worked example, the student's trying to understand, how did I figure that out, or where did that answer come from? So that taxes intrinsic load. And why that matters is that outline, that capacity, that's all the space you have. And so if my intrinsic load is high, there's not going to be a lot of space left over for productive learning. So our goal is to manage that and to keep it as low as possible when we know that other types of load will be high and we'll need that available space. So error rates, when students are making a lot of errors and they're having to pause and correct the error, or they realize on their own that they've made an error, that increases intrinsic load. If they have the skill, but it's taking them a long time to retrieve it, it's slow and effortful, that also increases intrinsic load and can tax working memory. And back to that unconstrained kind of codependent skills, if those pieces of information that they're needing to retrieve are tightly connected, we call that element interactivity, then that also takes up space in working memory. So long division, again, would be a good example of that, because you can't just remember one of those steps and get the problem correct. If you forget a step, it's going to mess up everything. So that's high element interactivity. So instead of that intrinsic load being about 1/3 of the cup, if any of those characteristics are true for a student in a learning environment, that intrinsic load could potentially take up all the working memory space. That means no productive learning can occur. So in addition to intrinsic load being challenging, extraneous load is a concern that we have to manage. And that is something that was talked about in earlier chapters in terms of distractions that can interfere with the learning process. So that could be, again, noise in a classroom, construction going on, a partner is tapping his or her pencil and I'm having a hard time focusing. But often it's more connected to poor instructional design. So maybe there are too many steps in a problem. Maybe I didn't provide a worked example. Maybe I gave some directions verbally and I gave some visually, and you as a student are trying to reconcile all of that information. But what's most common, and this is a really important consideration for students who might be getting a double dip or a triple dip of intervention in Tier 2 and Tier 3, it could be that they're managing inconsistent routines and procedures. Even something as simple as in my classroom, when we're spelling words, the teacher says the word, I repeat the word, we tap out to see what sounds we hear, and then we write it. But in my intervention, the teacher says the word, I repeat the word, we find letter tiles, and then we copy it down. Just even a slight alteration in the directions and the procedures can shift the focus from the content to the directions, and that increases extraneous load. So there are a lot of things, again, that we have to be mindful about because we have a limited amount of space to work with. And if I know that in my lesson today, I need to teach you a new routine or procedure, that means your extraneous load is going to be big. So what I'll need to do is do what I can to reduce intrinsic load to allow for that. If I know that today you've got a lot of information to retrieve and apply, I'm going to be really consistent with my routines and procedures so that that doesn't compete with the learning. So that's when a student isn't making progress, we might have to pause and see, is the load too heavy for any productive learning to be occurring? And that leftover space, germane load, that's the good load. And I guess I don't mean to imply that the others are bad. The others are unavoidable. But the more that we can manage them, the more opportunity we have for germane load to take up most of the working memory. And so I think germane, germinate, grow, good. It's where growth and learning happens. So if we have a lot of space available for that, we know that the students are doing more productive learning. So ways that we can increase that space for productive learning go back to really revisiting some of the things that you have been introduced to in this text, which is modeling and those worked examples that you're providing the students so that they have a quick and easy reference to support that retrieval that's taxing their intrinsic load. And then when we think about the objective of a lesson, these are the big kind of ahas for me as I was reading the research. If I'm teaching you something new, whether it's a new pattern like OA says O in the middle of a word or the beginning of a word, that's what I want the focus of your learning to be on. So the best way to help students acquire new information is to not compete with the new information by providing unclear directions. Be very consistent in your routines and procedures if the focus is on new content. So new content, old familiar routines and procedures. If I need to teach you a new routine and procedure, perhaps I'm teaching you a syllable division strategy so that you know how to break apart multisyllabic words. That's a pretty involved process initially. We've got to find our vowels. We need to find the consonants between them. We're going to decide where to split. So now it's the procedure that's the focus of the learning. It would be more effective for students then if we actually used words that were already familiar to them so that the word is not competing with the procedure. So it may feel like taking a step back, but it's an important step for giving the brain the space that it needs to acquire new learning.
Yeah, I could just add when I do my sentence writing lesson each day, when I first say teach a new conjunction, I use content that the kids are really familiar with. So say right now we're doing even though. So our practice has all been about snow days or toppings on pizza or things that all the kids have a lot of knowledge about. And then once we're good with the conjunction, then I start applying it into like our science content and into more difficult content. Would that kind of align with what you're talking about?
That is a perfect example, yes. And so, as you're trying to get them to learn how to use that conjunction appropriately, you don't want their brain to have to also make sense with the context of the sentence to see if it fits. You really want to know, do they understand how to use this conjunction? And so therefore you want them to be able to pull upon stuff that comes to them instantly and very familiar. Great example. So I want to take a look at how this information applies across tiers for intensification. And I was thinking maybe we should start with just kind of all getting on the same page with terminology, because we are across a border and it's possible that we're using different terms to mean the same thing. So I want to talk about MTSS as a system. I know where I live, we have a lot of individuals who may say, well, we do MTSS. And I think what they mean is we have a structured system for figuring out if students have qualified for a learning disability. And that might mean putting some sort of evaluation system in place. But that really isn't MTSS. MTSS is an actual system that is designed, it's a comprehensive framework that's designed to really meet the needs of all students. And it's meeting their needs beyond just academic. It is academic for sure, but it's behavior, it's social emotional. And because it's about a system, it's actually not just about kids. It's about the adults touching the kids too, in terms of, do they have the supports they need? Do they have a schedule that's actually working well so that the people who need to communicate about a student can actually communicate with each other? Do we have the right supports in terms of instructional materials, the right assessment tools, or are we duplicating efforts too much? Do teachers have access to the professional learning that they need to feel effective and empowered at their job? So MTSS is, again, a system that is created. And within MTSS, we do talk about intensification. So as we talk through intensification, I want to point out some pieces of a system that can help us do that more effectively and efficiently. So again, just to be really clear, that MTSS is about all students. It's not just about the students that we're concerned about academically. It's also about our typical learners, and do they have access to the information and opportunities that they need? Are we ensuring that there are proactive and preventative measures in place to make sure that they don't fall behind? Are we accelerating the students who are picking things up quickly? Or are we finding that they're just in the classroom kind of treading water, waiting for everybody else to catch up? So that's part of the system. The other part of the system that we touched on briefly is the allocation of resources. So, fair and equal are words that we can debate for a long time, but within the MTSS framework, allocating resources is about matching people to need. So if you happen to have a second grade classroom that has a high level of need, they would have different resources allocated to them than maybe a third grade classroom that doesn't have a lot of need. So that's part of an MTSS system. Again, with professional development, it also aligns what teachers need to be powerful and impactful. So we may not all be sitting in the same PD on written expression, because there may be some people who actually are really skilled at written expression, and there may be others who really need some behavior management support. So it's specializing the PD as well. And then the schedule part. So this is where I am not an administrator, and I don't pretend to have the skill set that an administrator needs, because when it comes to schedules, I think that's probably one of the most challenging things that an administrator has to manage, which is getting all the things done within the instructional day and making sure all the people have schedules that meet the needs of kids. But when it comes to that, we have to really think about when we're creating a master schedule, it's usually the specialists that end up kind of being that, well, see if you can work around this master schedule and access your kids. Or it might be, we have from 11 to 11:30 every day where fourth grade gets their intervention. And so all fourth graders who are identified as tier 2 or tier 3 get pulled at that time. And they may be in a group together, but they actually don't need the same thing. So MTSS, again, is matching those resources and schedules together. And we've talked again about the communication protocols, but when I work with schools, sometimes we have our professional learning communities, or we're doing our data-based decision-making conversations. Many times, the individuals who need to be at those meetings to talk about kids aren't available. They might be teaching a class at that time, or it might be a prep period and they're off somewhere and doing something else. So are we communicating, or are we scheduling systems that allow all the people involved with the child to be at the table when it comes to critical decision making? So a couple things to consider when we're talking about strengthening our MTSS framework. These are some big ideas that we might just want to reflect on. Do we feel like these things are in place? So where I live, we talk about academic standards and standards-based curriculum. So each state in our country has specific indicators or state standards that teachers are required to cover. They're very similar, they're not all that different, but they often help guide a pacing or scope and sequence. We also need to make sure that we are teaching systematically and explicitly. If discovery learning worked for a lot of students, we wouldn't need to show up at school with lesson plans to deliver them. So we need to be very explicit and very intentional about moving through our instruction in a, let me just tell you. It's more effective to just tell them, which is the title of, I think, the book that, oh gosh, why am I drawing a blank on his name that he just put out? Does that sound familiar to you? Just tell them. It's like on the floor here in my, now you guys know that my office is a mess. There we go. I think that's the one.
By
All right.
Dr. Rochelle.
Yes. I was like, wow, he was just on.
Yeah.
So a lot of the information in that text really gets to the part of, if we wait for them to discover, we risk a lot of things. They may discover the wrong thing. They may draw the wrong conclusion. And it's harder to correct a misconception than it is to just tell students the information that they need so that they can move forward. So that's a really important part of what you need to consider having in your MTSS framework. And then we have differentiation. And so when I was first learning about MTSS, it was coming off the heels of our RTI framework that we were using. And in our RTI framework, we had a belief system that followed all students received the same instruction in Tier 1 or core. And if students were having difficulty in Tier 1, they may be identified as needing Tier 2 supports. And so they may go with a specialist and they might have a 30-minute Tier 2 intervention. And if that wasn't effective, then we would refer them for Tier 3 intervention, and often Tier 3 meant special education. And that's actually not what an MTSS system is. An MTSS system means all kids get what they need across all tiers. So I'm going to ask you to think about the tiers of instruction almost as like a meal. So Tier 1 is like my main course. It's where I'm getting most of my nutrients and most of my needs met. But if I'm a student who, think back to word recognition for a moment, if I'm a student, maybe in a second grade classroom, and I still don't know what my short vowel sounds are, and I'm actually having some difficulty with some of the consonant sounds that my peers have acquired, I'm not getting a whole lot out of that multisyllabic word lesson that you're doing. And back to cognitive load, I'm trying to understand what the teacher is saying, but my intrinsic load is really heavy and unmanageable because I still don't know what some of those vowel sounds are that you're working with when you broke that word apart. Also, my extraneous load is heavy because you're teaching a lot of procedures and you're talking about vowels, and I might not actually be at the point yet that when I look at an unfamiliar word, I can quickly identify which letters are vowels. So because I don't have the prerequisite skills that my peers have, I sat through a meal that I actually couldn't eat. So did I really get core instruction? No, I watched core instruction, but I really didn't get anything out of it. And the harm in that model is that if my working memory gets taxed in core instruction, there's not really anything that you can do magically to empty that out and give me all this working memory space back so that when I do get pulled for Tier 2, I'm good to go. Usually, when a student's working memory is taxed, one of two things happens. I act out because I'm frustrated, or I check out. And so I may, in either of those options or any of those scenarios, I might actually get in trouble. And so once I'm in trouble, that's on my mind. And so now I've left for Tier 2, and I'm not ready to learn there either. So as we talk about MTSS, it doesn't count as a scoop unless it was a scoop that I benefited from. So that's a really important consideration in terms of, again, strengthening your MTSS model. Another one is flexible grouping. And so often when I talk about students should get in Tier 1 instruction that's at their level, people hear that as, well, that's tracking. And we were told a long time ago we can't do that. Well, data that informs what a student needs and is used to actually place them in their just right grouping isn't tracking. it's database decision making. And if that instruction is effective and I'm meeting their needs, then those groupings should be pretty fluid as students acquire those skills. And so differentiation in core instruction is effective, and that is part of an MTSS structure. That also is going to be coupled with student engagement and participation. So how often are we asking students to do something in the lesson? Are they having opportunities to respond either verbally or in writing? Verbally could be choral responses. They can be turn and talk to your partner and then report out, and so we can confirm correct responses. It could be write and hold up and show your answer, but they need high rates of response to actually be able to make sense of the information that you're presenting. And so also to be able to be attentive and present in a lesson, we need to have systems in our classroom that allow for that to happen. And I know that with the increase in behavior problems that many of us are dealing with, there tends to be a decrease in active participation and engagement because the shift becomes on behavior. But I would kind of throw myself out there and say, I think our increase in behavior has a lot to do with putting students in a stressful exposure model instead of a what do I need model of instruction. So then if we are aware of kind of the circumstances, what are some options? What are some solutions for taking this back to our classroom? So these are the researchers that I lean on for informing both how do we determine stages of proficiency? How do we know if kids know what they know? How do we know if the instruction is appropriately designed for them or taxing or too easy? And how can we take that information and customize instruction? So I've never met a teacher who has been able to say, I have all the time I need to do all the things, and I wouldn't mind giving up more of my weekend time for lesson planning. Like, that has never been said. So how can we make this doable? Well, similar to readings that you have already looked at, there are different stages of proficiency. It's not that we teach something and kids suddenly got it. It doesn't work that way. So within this continuum or instructional hierarchy, when you're presenting new information, it's acquisition. Slow, effortful, kids are trying to make sense of the information. Obviously, that is not mastery or proficiency. Stage 2 is fluency. So my accuracy has increased, and now my instructional goal for you as a teacher is to increase your rate. And it's that rate piece that's really powerful to allow you to do more advanced application of that skill. So if I have accuracy and I have good rate, then I'm really at the generalization stage now. And now you're going to help me apply that into more novel situations. Because it is one thing for a child to be able to read a word that they have seen over and over again. It's quite another for them to read a word with the same pattern that they've never seen before. That's generalization. And so often when I'm talking with teachers, I hear comments like, I don't really understand. They're doing so well in the phonics lesson and they know that skill. But then when they go to read a passage that has that same skill in it, they look like they've never seen it before. That budge or that gap between fluency and generalization is real. And for some kids, it's overwhelming. And so through manipulating forms of practice and making sure that we reduce cognitive load, we're more effective at getting them to that generalization stage. And then the last stage is adaptation. And in adaptation, now what we're doing is we're asking students to integrate lots of different pieces of information together to start to problem solve and really become an expert at something. And so in this example, again, what's kind of different is they've mastered their basic addition facts, but this is an unexpected arrangement. And so they really have to draw upon their understanding of both the basic addition facts and the concept that when a number is missing, we may have to do a reverse operation to figure that out. So that's an example of adaptation. I thought it might be helpful if you're interested in going back at some point and kind of looking at these descriptors of the different stages, because it's not that it's going to be really obvious to see, oh, a child has moved today into fluency. They're going to have characteristics of maybe 2 stages at one time. But your awareness of these stages can help you know how to modify really easily instructional materials to help get kids from the stage that they're currently in to the next stage. And the way that that is done is with forms of practice. So we're going to look at a couple examples of these forms of practice, but the point here is there's no such thing as a perfect curriculum. And if there was, we'd all be using it. But most materials are good enough to be enhanced and improved upon when we understand, what they're lacking. So as we look at some examples of practice, this does require a little bit of time to manipulate, but if we can take our existing materials and content that the students are familiar with and reorganize them, we can support some kids who are stuck in specific stages. So it's not just giving more practice. Giving more practice sometimes doesn't change outcomes. We have to know what kind of practice the students need. So the categories that I want to introduce you to, if you're not familiar with them, the first group is really related to the physical presentation of the materials. So this is what it looks like to the student. And we have blocked practice, which you'll see an example of. And blocked practice is really effective at reducing load. It's easier, so kids can really focus on the content. The opposite of that would be interleaved or mixed practice, and that increases load. It's harder because it starts to combine many different things together. So those are the physical presentations. The next category is really about frequency. How much practice are we providing in a period of time? Massed practice is like cramming for a test. It's a lot of practice in a short period of time. And the opposite of that would be spaced and distributed. So that's taking practice but spreading it out over time. So just like blocked and interleaved, they both have strengths and purposes. Massed practice is really good for quickly learning something. It's what we did back when we used to have to learn phone numbers. We used to say them over and over again, 255-9047, 255, and you practice it over and over again. That's massed. But the problem with massed practice is you forget things quickly when you do learn them that way. So after we've learned something in massed practice, we should move to spaced and distributed. Spaced and distributed practice is the kind of practice that happens over time. Those are the things that are in your memory, your long-term memory, that you couldn't forget, like the phone number of the house that you grew up on. That's because you practiced it in massed to memorize it, but think of all the times you had to retrieve it. That's why you still remember it. It's probably why it's a password to some bank account or something that you have now. So when we think about applying those forms of practice to those stages of learning or proficiency and how it impacts cognitive load, you might see how this will actually help us intensify instruction for those kids that we're concerned about. So back to that first stage of proficiency acquisition. So again, when I'm learning something new, that's a lot, that's a heavy load. So I need consistent routines and procedures, and I probably would benefit from massed practice, lots of repetition, and blocked practice. So those two forms of practice, when combined, support retrieval. So I will increase my accuracy pretty quickly in those two forms of practice. And here's what blocked practice looks like. So these are two patterns. Maybe I've taught them in the same phonics lesson because they really complement each other. I've taught that AI is a spelling for the sound A, and we see it at the beginning of a word like in aid or aim, or in the middle of the word like you see here. And that on the other end of that, we have AY, says A, but it's the spelling used at the end of a word, and we see that here. What makes this blocked is if you look at how they're stacked, it's very easy to see that pattern, even if I didn't have it color-coded for you. And so what happens then, students are set up for success. They would get into kind of this pattern of A, that they could read down the column, wait, paid, raid, claim. The challenge here is that this is really good in the acquisition stage, but we can't stay here, because if we stay here too long, we get a false sense of security that the kids know their stuff, and they don't. They were just on autopilot. So once we hit, and this is kind of what my dissertation was trying to understand, is there a sweet spot for blocked practice and acquisition before we change? And with a small sample size that I had, I can't say that this is, a definitive number, but at least in the study that I did, 95% accuracy seemed to be a pretty sweet spot to hit. So for kids who hit 95% accuracy in blocked practice, then we moved them to, and this is just an example that blocked practice can also occur in advanced content, but after 95% accuracy, we switched to interleaved practice. That's because, again, remember my goal in acquisition is accuracy. So you got to that accuracy spot. I want to maintain your accuracy, grow it even if I can, but now I want to focus on your automaticity of your retrieval. So what I want to do to avoid that autopilot effect, I'm going to put it in an interleaved list. So this is an interleaved list. You'll see a couple AI words, you'll see a couple AY words, but they're not stacked anymore. What's happened is we've pulled in old content. And by pulling in old content, if you're still reading those patterns that we recently worked on correctly, then I know that you probably know your stuff better. But if I kept you in blocked practice, I would have had no way of knowing. So this is a really good form of practice to manipulate when we're in the fluency stage. If, though, I move you to this form of practice and you are starting to increase your errors, I simply go back to blocked, and I might spend a little bit more time there before I move here again, because we do not want to give up accuracy for rate. That's never a good option. So again, an advanced example of what interleaved practice could look like. So those are really essential for managing cognitive load, because again, if I am learning something new, cognitive load is high. And so what I have to do is decrease the extraneous load to allow you the time and support you need to just acquire that new skill. The goal of fluency is to help your automation, because you have to be quick enough at something that you can apply it in a harder setting. So before I would put you into connected text, I need you to be accurate and automatic. You need to be at the fluency stage of those skills. And that's probably one concern I have about a traditional phonics curriculum, is they often learn a new skill and then it shows up in that connected text passage in the same lesson. And for our typical learners, that's fine. But for our students who are having difficulty, that's too much for them. And that's where they feel defeated and they make a lot of errors and they don't see the benefit of what they were learning. So that bridge between fluency and generalization, that can be a big and hard process for a lot of kids, is something that we need to really think through. How are we managing that for them? How are we reducing the load to make them successful in applying and generalizing that skill? And so I have a couple of suggestions for you that have worked for the population that we're talking about, the ones who are not successful doing that at the same rate as their peers. So the bridge that I have been building for students that I'm working with is to consider moving still in interleaved practice, but expanding the size of the content. So we might transition into phrase reading, sentence reading, and connected text reading. Even if you were an older student, we might still use phrases and sentences plus connected text. But what's going to happen is that phrase or sentence reading is going to be based on content that's probably 2 to 3 lessons behind what we're working on right now. And why is that? Well, that's because you should be more accurate and automatic with the content that was 2 or 3 lessons behind. The added benefit to that too is that gave you distributed practice so that you don't have time to forget the things that you worked so hard to learn a few lessons ago. Because for our students that are the most fragile, it's often not that they didn't eventually learn it, they did. It's just that they forgot it. And so we might think that they got there, and 2 weeks from now, we're like, you knew this a couple weeks ago, and they look at you like, I've never seen this before. That's what happens when we don't continually review. So use phrases and sentences, base them on content that's 2 to 3 lessons behind. And then, so it might look like this if you are an early reader. So if I look at these passages or these phrases and these sentences, nothing in these phrases and sentences should reflect what I taught you today. What should be here would be content that was in my rear view mirror, again, 2 to 3 lessons. Then, if you're successful, I would promote that content to a connected text passage. So the connected text passage for the students that we're most concerned about tends to work well if it is further behind today's lesson, more like 5 lessons or so behind. And so what, again, that's doing is it's providing that student who's having difficulty with more time to get accurate and automatic on a skill before they're applying it in an advanced setting. And it reduces the fact that they're going to forget it, because we lost the massed practice effect of short-term learning, and we've increased the long-term effect by continually retrieving information that we have learned. Again, if we can get kids to generalization, our goal in adaptation is just to keep them from forgetting. And so to support them in doing that problem solving. That's the goal of adaptation, is support them to do multi-step processes in a more authentic context. So I thought it was interesting when John Sweller talks about the situation of long-term memory and being an expert at something in the context of adaptation. It's that last sentence that really stood out to me. Without automation, performance is slow, clumsy, and prone to error. It's an essential mechanism of learning. And so I think, again, for the student who's having difficulty, they're going to be slow. They're not going to be automatic yet with the skill. That increases their errors. So putting that new skill in a connected text pattern is going to create extensive load for them. So that's where modifying our materials to meet their needs may be helpful. So as we kind of wrap up this section, I thought it might be helpful if we consider cognitive load and constrained skills and unconstrained skills and kind of working around a proactive and preventative model of supporting kids. What could that look like in a literacy block? And you may have different time constraints and minute requirements than I have here, but what tends to work well in some settings is to take that word recognition block where students are really building a systematic sequential progression through phonics skills and skill-based group. So put students in their just right level, which may mean sharing kids across a building with different teachers or across a grade level. So they would go to their phonics lesson that was at their level based on data, and some would go to another classroom. I'm not going to be cognitively overloaded if the lesson is designed based on my needs and my prerequisite skills. So that becomes homogeneous grouping. And again, those groupings may not be super fluid because of the systematic order in which those skills are developed. It's very rare that a student would acquire enough skills quickly to go, well, I'm going to move on to, Mrs. Jones' room. That may need to be a little bit more structured. However, unconstrained skills, which do not have to develop in the same linear way, work out really well in a heterogeneous grouping, where the skill set is very dynamic. And some students have more advanced vocabulary that they can help their peers acquire, or background knowledge on a subject matter. And again, that tends to work out well as a classroom setting heterogeneous. So the goal with that is proactive and preventative, because what we want to do is we want to avoid how much time kids are working independently when possible. And that's because no new learning really happens when you're working independently. Independent time is only effective for practicing something that I already know. So as I shared just a little bit of research with you on that, many of you already know that. You only have independent time because you don't have another choice. You have to work with a group of kids, and so they're going to have to do something to be productive. But how we group kids matters. And so just putting students in a group because they have a similar skill set isn't the magic bullet either. We have to make sure that that instruction is aligned with what they need. And if I were to make decisions about what that looks like, these are the guiding points. So am I prescriptive? Do I specifically know what that group of students needs based on the diagnostic data that I've gathered? Do I have a specific skill focus based on that data? And am I delivering that instruction in a systematic, explicit way that uses the right form of practice for the stage of proficiency that that skill is in? And so that's what makes an intervention effective, when it is specialized and intensive and intentional, consistent, and structured. And that structure part, again, reduces cognitive load. I have just a couple of quick examples to show you of what that might look like, because this is an intervention. I want to point out that in the upper left-hand corner, it says this is a 5 to 7 minute intervention. An intervention isn't an intervention just because of the time frame. An intervention isn't an intervention because of the group size. It's an intervention when it is diagnostic and prescriptive. When data tells me what a student needs and I provide that, that's an intervention. So I want you to notice that these group sizes are slightly different. So what you see on the left side is a really short description of what's happening. So I have 4 different skills that my data says I need to target. This is a very basic first grade classroom. I have two phonemic awareness tasks. One is segmentation, and these kids are having difficulty spelling. And when I drilled down, I realized there was an underlying phonemic awareness issue. They couldn't segment speech sounds. I have another group of kids that was making a lot of errors in their decoding. And again, when I drilled down, they were having a hard time holding on to the sounds long enough in their head to blend. These were the kids that did something like this, app, run. And you were like, what just happened? Because they couldn't hold on to the sounds. So that's our intervention. Notice across the top row, I have originally in my group, I have these 7 kids that are coming back and working on segmentation with me. They need it at the 2 phoneme level. But then I'm going to pick up later in the week these other 4 students. They're going to join. That's not really a small group. That's a group of 11 kids. I have 11 kids who need that. 11 kids are going to get it. I don't have to make them groups of 3 or 4 for it to be an intervention. And so again, as we kind of look down there, several different examples of skills, and the group sizes change, and then the structure changes. That phonics one that's highlighted, notice that I'm planning on doing a blocked list early in the week of these single consonants and digraphs that the kids are working on, and then I'm going to move to an interleave list so I always know where I'm going. I can do that same type of structure with any grade level. It's that targeted, that I only am working on that one skill that allows me to be efficient enough to do it in 5 to 7 minutes. So this is just an example of that pronoun group. They were having a hard time tracking back the pronoun to the antecedent that it referred to. So when they were reading words like it and they were confused in the passage. And so as we warmed them up and talked about the pronouns and what the pronoun was replacing, then we applied it later in the week to see if they understood. And here was kind of an interesting one. The word their, T-H-E-I-R, and they were thinking that in this passage, those pronouns represented scientists because the word scientist was used in a paragraph earlier. That's not what they meant or their meant. It was plants, dead plants. And so that interfered with their ability to comprehend. So again, whether it's language comprehension or phonics, I have to get to the point of knowing what the cause is. And I need to not be so concerned about the size of the group, nor who's pulling them. It doesn't have to be a specialist who's doing the intervention. A classroom teacher knows this content too. The classroom teacher probably knows the kids very well too. And so being able to target what those students specifically need and deliver that in a small intensive dose consistently with the right kind of practice is effective. So as I turn it over to see what kind of questions and follow-up conversations we have, these are the things I'm hoping that we'll be able to pull together and take into our classroom, that we can be effective across all tiers. If we can pinpoint when a child has missing prerequisite skills, that's increasing cognitive load, intrinsic load, and we're going to have to manage that. Ideally, if I go back to my long division example, if I had assessment tools to pinpoint those prerequisite skills that were lacking, I'd actually pre-teach them before the lesson even became an issue for them. And so prioritizing our instruction, what's our goal? If it's new content, familiar routines and procedures. If it's a new procedure, old content. Laura, I feel like I just fire hosed information. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and see what follow-up questions or comments you might want to address.
Okay. Well, I can just add an example of something I'm doing in my classroom that kind of resonated with what you said. So out of my 20 students, I now have 12 at benchmark. And then I have 8 who are still, we're working at 2 different skills. So I've separated it into 2 groups. So I do 6 to 7 minutes of repeated reading every day. My whole class does it. My 12 students at benchmark, like they can do it independently. So I've taught the routines, taught the behaviors, they get with their partners. They're doing different types of texts. Some of them are from, I'm having what's the website where you can download reading passages
There's
content.
So many good ones.
Yeah. ReadWorks. Thank you, someone.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. ReadWorks. That's the one.
Look at all the
Some of them are
teachers who
doing
do it
ReadWorks.
right
Some
away.
of them are just doing repeated reading with like the book that they're reading. But then I have 8 kids. So then I'm pulling them and when we do repeated reading, we're doing it as a group. So then I can provide immediate feedback as we're doing it. So at that time, their fluency goals is at kind of consonant blends at the beginning and end, digraphs, and we're beginning into silent E syllable. Later on, I meet with those kids again, and we're doing vowel teams, but just at the word and the sentence level. So I kind of have those 8 kids, I kind of have 2 little 5-6 minute of extra dosage, but one is at the fluency stage, which is earlier in the sequence. And the second one is at the acquisition stage, which is later on in the sequence at vowel teams. Is that kind of like, I'm trying to help out with their cognitive load because they're getting overwhelmed at the fluency stage, or if I give them vowel teams in a text, they make too many errors. So that's kind of why I've slid this way. Is that kind of what you're?
That is 100% right on, because I like that you notice that about your students. And yes, to expect a skill to go through all of those stages at one time is not common, not for a student who's having difficulty. But yes, our kids who basically walked by the library and learned how to read, and there are not a lot of them, they'll be fine with that. But those are not the kids that we're concerned about. So the fact that you've staggered, and I always think about it like a skill is in queue. What is it in queue for? Is it in queue to be promoted to sentences, or is it in sentences now and it's in queue to be promoted to connected text passage? And again, you don't have to go create materials, use your materials, but I take little Post-it notes, and I put Post-it notes on the pages that contain content that they're ready to do at the sentence level, and a Post-it note for the content that they're ready to do at the connected text level. And that just makes the process easier. So yep, you're just always moving things from the easier level of application to the more advanced level.
Now, going with that, there was a question in the chat. So if you have a program like Wilson's Foundations in Ontario, we see a lot of UFly right now. Do we make that hard choice to stick with the program as much as we can without reducing the routine changes? Or is it better to use these practices in small groups?
Good. Because you probably are also feeling the whole teach with fidelity, like tug too.
Mm-hmm.
I think when a student is showing you that they're having a hard time keeping up, and you see that accuracy is not where it needs to be, or automaticity doesn't develop, I think that presentation argues for stay with the routines and the procedures, but back up when you're expecting them again to do something harder, back up to easier content. But if the kids are already used to the routines and procedures, that's low-hanging fruit. I would stick with that, build on it. It sets them up for success. I would only modify routines and procedures if it was the routine or procedure itself that was actually causing cognitive load. I would argue, and I haven't done this as research, so this is just me talking. No, I have nothing to cite what I'm saying. But I do think some of the word chaining activities can in many ways increase cognitive load. And the reason I suspect that and would be interested in testing it is because of all the language that's involved in telling kids what to do. All right, so build the word step. They built the word step. And so they had to think about segmenting and finding the tiles, or they wrote it. All right, now change the in step to stop, or change to Well, they have to remember all those things. So is that really a decoding task? Is it really even an encoding task? I think that's actually a working memory task, not so much reading and spelling. So that may be an example of when you might consider altering a procedure.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting example. Like, I can see that when I do those word chains with my students. Sometimes is it that they can't do the skill, or their working memory is overloaded trying to figure out where the sound is.
Right.
It's very interesting. Okay, I see the time, so I'm just going to wrap us up. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Peavler. That was fantastic. I love hearing from experts who can share real applications on how I can put the evidence into practice with my classroom full of students. Like, I think everybody in the chat has something we can try new tomorrow. So now let's return back to our evidence-informed educator series. Remember, these visuals are designed to be a launching point to get learning started. Share one with a colleague, recommend the book and the recordings of the book study, and encourage others to learn about evidence-informed practices. So first, we have the simple view of reading, and followed up by ONLit's structured literacy infographic. This infographic provides a comprehensive visual guide to structured literacy. We have definitions of the Matthew and Peter effect as found on page 93 of the book. We have a brief overview of the 3 tiers of vocabulary. And 1 page about intensity and dosage. The intensification strategy checklist from the National Center on Intensive Intervention is another great tool educators can use to reflect on our instruction. The link's going in the chat. So now let's wrap up our session and plan our next steps, because I know some of us have a hockey game to go watch. Our 4th session will be on Thursday, March 6th at 7:15 Eastern Standard Time. We will cover chapters 8 and 9 on effective mathematics instruction and the importance of knowledge. Our Informed Insights guest will be Dr. Robin Cotting. Dr. Cotting is a professor of school psychology at Northeastern University, associate editor of academic journals, and co-author of the book Effective Math Interventions, a guide to improving whole number knowledge. She will share her expertise on conceptual understanding and procedural fluency, worked examples, and retrieval practice. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I look forward to seeing you all again on March 6th. Let's bring joy to our students by harnessing the science of learning together.